Welcome back. In this video, we're going to take a quick review at adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing real numbers. So, quick review of addition. If you're adding two numbers with the same sign, we'll simply add their absolute values and use the common sign in the answer. So, for that, we might have something like, 6 plus 3. Well, we all know that that equals 9. Whereas if we had a negative 6 plus a negative 3, well, here we'll use their common sign, a negative sign, in our answer, and that is negative 9. If we're adding two numbers with different signs, we would subtract their absolute values. We'd use the sign of the number with the larger absolute value in your answer. So, for example, if we had 14 plus, say, a negative 20. Okay, we're adding those two numbers together. Well, 14 and 20, we know, hopefully we know they're 6 apart, and we subtracted their absolute values, and then we use the number of the larger sign in our answer. So this is going to be 14 minus 20, which is negative 6. And that leads us right into subtraction. I've kind of used subtraction before defining it, but subtraction is simply the addition of the opposite. So A plus the opposite of B is A minus B. Okay? And opposites, real quick, opposites are two numbers that have the same distance from 0 but lie on opposite sides of 0 on the number line. Opposites are also known as additive inverses, and you will need to know this when we get to our properties, the property of additive inverse. So make a note of this. So A plus the opposite of A equals 0. So A and the opposite of A are opposites or additive inverses. Okay? So, for example, if we had 14 plus a negative 10, well, we're going to drop this plus or minus business in high school. I'm going to take off if I see plus or minus. That is simply 14 minus 10, which is 4. Okay, so drop the A plus the opposite of B, have it. Okay, as I say, this is big boy math, so we're not going to do plus or minus anymore. Multiplication. Multiplication is repeated addition. A few helpful hints here for multiplication. If we multiply or even divide an even number of negative numbers, the result will be positive. So a negative times a negative times a negative times a negative. If we have 4 negatives, we have an even number of negatives, the result will be a positive result. Negative times a negative is positive, negative times a negative is positive, positive. If we multiply and divide an odd number of negatives, our result will be negative. So 3 negative numbers, 5 negative numbers, 1 negative number. If we're multiplying, we're going to end up with 1 with a negative number. I alluded to properties a minute ago. There's another property here, the zero product property, so get ready for that. Make sure you've got this written down. We're going to have a separate area for all properties, so I have this ready. But a number times 0 will equal 0. So anything, any factor or number of factors multiplied by 0 will equal 0. So 0 times 10 times 15 times 25 times negative 42. That's real easy. It's 0 times any of this. Our result is going to be 0. So any number multiplied by 0 or series of numbers multiplied by 0, the result will be 0. Again, be careful with exponents when multiplying. You've seen this example in the past. The opposite of 4 squared. So it's the opposite of 4 squared. So it's the opposite of 4 times 4. Or sometimes I put the negative 1 in there. It's negative 1 times 4 times 4. It's the opposite of 16. versus this one, the opposite of 4 squared, well, that's negative 4 times negative 4. I have a negative times a negative. I have an even number of negatives here, and I get positive 16. So be careful with that kind of thing. Division, by definition, is multiplication by the reciprocal. We've already talked about reciprocals, and we've seen division of multiplication and division of fractions, but A divided by B is in fraction form A over B, or A over 1 times 1 over B. So that is A divided by B. So, for example, 17 divided by 5 halves is equal to 17 times 2/5. Division is multiplication by the reciprocal. So we multiply by the reciprocal, and that's 34/5. Okay? We've already defined reciprocals. We've seen that already this year. Two numbers whose product is 1. We talked about the multiplicative inverse. That's what reciprocals are. Okay? So A times its reciprocal, 1 over A, is 1. That's the property of the multiplicative inverse. You've seen 3 properties in this video already that you are going to need to know how to apply. And we use this multiplicative inverse all the time in algebra in solving algebraic equations. If we had something like 5 halves x equals 11, guys that have done algebra already would know that we can multiply both sides by 2/5, because 2/5 times 5 halves is 1. So we've isolated 1x. We use the property of the multiplicative inverse all the time in solving algebraic equations. So we get x equals, what would that be, 22/5. Now we're getting ahead of ourselves, but that property is going to come into play very frequently in our algebraic future. Also remember, working with fractions, that thou shalt not divide by 0. 0 in the denominator of the fraction, or underneath, in the underneath, makes the fraction undefined. So if we have 5 over 0, that is undefined. Versus 0 over 5, 0 is in the numerator, that is 0. Automatically. If 0 is in the numerator, it doesn't matter what the denominator is, that fraction is 0. Same thing with undefined. 0 is in the denominator, we don't care what the numerator is, that thing's undefined. 0 over 0, that's another story. And finally, placement of negative signs in division, or in especially fractions. Okay? Frequently, young math students with the fraction the opposite of 5 halves say, where's the negative sign? I don't know where to put the negative sign. Do I put it in the middle? Do I put it on the top? Do I put it underneath? Well, this is the same thing as the opposite of 5 over a positive 2. That's okay. Or it's positive 5 over negative 2. That's okay. These are all the same thing. Negative 5 halves, the opposite of 5 over positive 2, or 5 over the opposite of 2. These are all equivalent, and we'll see that when we're working with slope, or we work with the fraction rise over run, that these are equivalent slopes. If we go down 5 and to the right 2 is the same as going up 5 and to the left 2. That's the same slope. Okay, so a little review on placement of negative signs in fractions. So that should arm you pretty well for this whole series of sections on adding, subtracting, and multiplying and dividing real numbers. If you have additional questions, we can cover those when I see you in class.